The rain came down like bullets on Highway 50. It wasn't the gentle kind of rain that whispered promises of spring
You think you
or
can just
washed away
walk
the
in
dust of a
here?
long summer. This was Nevada
You
desert
can't be
rain,
here. Try
violent
and
and
stop me.
unforgiving, the kind that turned dirt roads into rivers and made even the most experienced riders question whether they should pull over and wait it out. Garrett Briggs didn't pull over. He leaned into the wind, his massive frame hunched over the handlebars of his Harley Road King Rain, hammering against the leather cut that bore the Iron Reaper patch across his broad shoulders. The highway stretched out before him like a black ribbon, disappearing into darkness, illuminated only by brief flashes of lightning that split the sky and revealed the endless expanse of sagebrush and rock on either side. It was 10:30 at night, and he had been riding for 6 hours straight. His hands ached from gripping the throttle. His shoulders burned from fighting the crosswinds that tried to push him off the road. Water had long since found its way past his collar, soaking through his shirt and running cold down his spine. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Because in 3 days, his son was getting married, and Garrett hadn't been invited. The wedding invitation sat folded in the inside pocket of his jacket, protected from the rain by layers of worn leather. He had received it 2 weeks ago, forwarded to him at the Iron Reaper Clubhouse in Carson City, because Caleb didn't know where his father actually lived. Or maybe Caleb knew and simply didn't care enough to send it to a real address. The invitation had been addressed to the clubhouse, not to Garrett's home, not to his apartment, to the place where broken men went to forget they had families. Garrett had opened the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, expecting nothing, hoping for everything. Inside was a formal card with elegant script announcing the marriage of Caleb James Briggs to Abigail Rose Fletcher. The ceremony would take place at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Reno, Nevada on Sunday, November 24th at 11 o'clock in the morning. There had been no personal note, no invitation to the reception, no phone number to RSVP, just the card and the silence that came with it. Garrett had stood there in the clubhouse garage, oil stains on the concrete floor beneath his boots, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Luther Kane, the club president, had walked by, seen the look on Garrett's face, and simply squeezed his shoulder once before walking away. Because Luther understood. Luther knew what it meant when your children looked at you and saw nothing worth saving. That had been 2 weeks ago. Now Garrett was riding through a storm, heading to Reno, with no plan except to stand outside the cathedral and catch a glimpse of his son through the church doors. Maybe see Caleb smile. Maybe watch him marry the woman he loved. Maybe just exist in the same space for 5 minutes and pretend that 12 years of silence hadn't built a wall too high to climb. He wasn't going inside. He knew that much. Caleb had made it clear through his silence that Garrett Briggs' former husband, former father, current member of the Iron Reaper Motorcycle Club, was not welcome at this new chapter of his son's life. And Garrett couldn't blame him. Another flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, and Garrett saw the sign he'd been watching for Desert Star Diner 2 miles. The neon glow of the restaurant appeared moments later, a soft pink haze cutting through the rain like a beacon for the lost and the lonely. Garrett downshifted and turned into the parking lot. The Harley's engine rumbled to a stop, and the sudden silence was almost louder than the rain. Garrett sat there for a moment, water streaming off his helmet, his hands still gripping the handlebars as if letting go would mean admitting he had nowhere left to ride toward. He thought about Anna, his wife, Caleb's mother, the woman who had loved him completely until cancer took her 12 years ago, leaving behind a 15-year-old boy and a husband who didn't know how to be a father without her. Anna had been the strong one, the steady one. She had been the reason Garrett worked 2 jobs and came home every night. She had been the reason he believed in goodness, in second chances, in the idea that a man could be more than the sum of his mistakes. And when she died, Garrett had fallen apart so completely that he forgot he still had a son who needed him. He had spent 6 months drowning in whiskey and guilt, barely able to get out of bed, let alone care for a grieving teenager. Caleb had learned to cook his own meals, learned to take the bus to school, learned to forge his father's signature on permission slips because Garrett was either too drunk or too broken to sign them himself. By the time Garrett finally crawled out of the darkness and joined the Iron Reaper MC, searching for brotherhood to replace the family he'd abandoned, Caleb had already learned the most important lesson of his young life: his father could not be counted on. Garrett climbed off the bike, his legs stiff and aching. He pulled off his helmet and ran a hand through his wet hair, now more gray than brown, and looked up at the diner. The Desert Star had been here for as long as Garrett could remember. It was one of those timeless roadside places that seemed to exist outside of normal reality, a refuge for truckers and travelers and people with nowhere else to go. The building itself was small and square, aluminum siding painted a faded turquoise, with a neon sign above the door that flickered pink and blue in the rain. Through the water-streaked windows, Garrett could see the warm glow of fluorescent lights and the shapes of people moving inside. He walked to the door and pulled it open. The bell above the entrance chimed brightly, a cheerful sound that felt almost obscene against the violence of the storm outside. Garrett stepped inside and the smell hit him immediately: burnt coffee, frying bacon, the faint chemical tang of industrial cleaning products. It was the smell of every diner he'd ever been in, comforting in its familiarity. The interior was exactly what he expected. A long counter with red vinyl stools ran along the left side, behind which a tired-looking waitress wiped down the coffee machine with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Booths lined the right wall, their cracked red seats patched with duct tape. The floor was black and white linoleum, scuffed and yellowed with age. 3 other people occupied the diner. At the counter, a truck driver slumped over a plate of eggs, his head nodding dangerously close to the runny yolks as he fought to stay awake. In a booth near the window, 2 college-age kids sat close together, whispering and occasionally glancing nervously in Garrett's direction. Garrett was used to that reaction. At 6'3" and 240 pounds, with a thick beard streaked with gray and arms covered in faded tattoos, he cut an intimidating figure even without the Iron Reaper patch on his back. People saw the leather, the skull, and crossbones insignia, the words Nomad Chapter, stitched in white thread, and they made assumptions. Most of those assumptions were wrong, but Garrett had learned long ago that explaining himself to strangers was a waste of breath. He chose a booth in the back corner out of habit more than necessity. 30 years of riding with outlaw clubs had taught him to always sit with his back to the wall, always keep the exits in view, always assume that trouble could walk through the door at any moment. The waitress approached with a coffee pot and a tired smile. She was in her early 40s, Garrett guessed, with auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail, and the kind of lived-in face that suggested she'd seen plenty of hard years, but refused to let them break her. Her name tag read Iris. Garrett looked up and recognition flickered across her face. "Garrett Briggs," she said softly. He blinked in surprise. "Do I know you?" Iris set down the coffee pot and crossed her arms, studying him with an expression that was hard to read. "You saved my father's life 8 years ago, right outside this diner." The memory came back slowly. A hot summer night, Garrett passing through on his way to Sacramento. 2 men with guns trying to rob the elderly owner of the Desert Star. Garrett had intervened without thinking, the way he always did when he saw someone helpless, being hurt by someone strong. He had sent both men to the hospital and the old man back inside his diner, and then he had climbed on his bike and ridden away before the police arrived, because men with his record didn't stick around to give statements. "Your father," Garrett said quietly. "Pete Calloway." "That's right." Iris poured coffee into the mug in front of him without asking if he wanted any. "He passed away 2 years ago, heart attack. But he talked about you until the end, called you his guardian angel." She smiled faintly. "Though I don't think most angels ride Harleys." Garrett looked down at his coffee. "I'm sorry about your father." "Don't be, he lived a good life." Iris pulled out a rag and wiped down the already clean table, a nervous gesture. "What brings you through town, still running from something or finally running toward it?" The question caught him off guard. Garrett wrapped his hands around the warm mug and considered lying. But there was something about Iris Calloway, something about the way she looked at him without fear or judgment, that made him want to tell the truth. "My son's getting married in 3 days," he said. "In Reno. I wasn't invited, but I'm going anyway. Thought I'd stand outside the church, maybe catch a glimpse of him. Let him know I'm still here, even if he doesn't want me to be." Iris was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down across from him, which surprised Garrett even more than her recognition. "My father and I didn't speak for 15 years, she said. "I left home when I was 18, angry at him for things that seemed important at the time, but that I can't even remember now. I had a daughter, got married, got divorced, and through all of it, I told myself I didn't need him." She looked out the window at the rain. "Then one day I got a call that he'd had a stroke. I drove here from Portland, convinced I'd arrived too late, convinced I'd lost my chance. But he held on. And when I walked into his hospital room, you know what he said?" Garrett shook his head. "He said, 'I knew you'd come.' Not 'where have you been?' Not 'why did it take so long?' Just 'I knew you'd come.'" Iris turned back to him. "Parents and children hurt each other. It's what we do. But showing up anyway, even when you're not invited, even when it hurts, that's how you start building the bridge back." Before Garrett could respond, the bell above the door chimed again. Both of them looked toward the entrance. An elderly woman stumbled through the doorway, soaked to the bone, her white hair plastered to her skull, rain dripping from the hem of her wool coat onto the linoleum floor. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with a thin frame that trembled visibly as she stood in the entrance, one hand gripping the doorframe as if she needed it to stay upright. But it wasn't her appearance that made Garrett's instincts flare. It was the look in her eyes, pure, undiluted terror. The woman's gaze darted around the diner, moving frantically from the truck driver at the counter to the college kids by the window to Iris standing at Garrett's booth. She was searching for something, or running from something. Then her eyes locked onto Garrett. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Garrett saw her take in his size, the leather cut, the hard edges of a man who had lived a violent life. Most people would have turned away. Most people would have chosen the college kids, or the waitress, or even the half-asleep truck driver. But this woman, this terrified elderly woman with rain streaming down her face, made a decision in that instant that would change everything. She walked straight toward him. Her steps were unsteady but determined, and as she got closer, Garrett could see just how frightened she truly was. Her eyes were red-rimmed and glassy with tears she was fighting desperately to hold back. Her breathing came in short, shallow gasps. Her hands shook so badly that she had to grip the edge of his table to keep them still. Iris stood up quickly, concern flooding her face. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need me to call someone?" The woman didn't answer. She was looking only at Garrett. And then she did something that stopped his heart. She dropped to her knees beside the booth. An old woman, 70 if she was a day, knelt on the dirty diner floor in her soaked coat and gripped Garrett's hand with surprising strength. Her skin was ice cold and paper thin, and he could feel every bone in her fingers. She leaned close, her voice barely louder than the rain hammering the windows outside. 6 words. 6 desperate, impossible words that would haunt Garrett for the rest of his life. "Please pretend you're my grandson, sir." Garrett stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. "What?" The woman's grip tightened. "Please, I'm begging you. Just for a few minutes, please." Before Garrett could respond, before he could ask any of the 1,000 questions flooding his mind, bright headlights swept across the front windows of the diner. A black SUV had just pulled into the parking lot. The woman's entire body went rigid. The color drained from her face. "He's here," she whispered, panic flooding her voice. "Oh God, he found me." Garrett turned his head slowly toward the window, every instinct he'd honed over 3 decades of hard living, suddenly screaming danger. The SUV's engine idled for a moment, headlights cutting through the rain like white knives. Then it shut off. The woman grabbed Garrett's arm with both hands, now her nails digging into his leather jacket. "Please," she whispered again, tears streaming down her face. "They killed my husband. They'll kill me too. I have no one. No one. You look like—" Her voice broke. "You look like my son-in-law, like David. He died with my daughter 22 years ago. Please, just pretend, just for a moment." The diner door opened. A man stepped inside, and Garrett knew immediately that this was no ordinary situation. The stranger was tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing a gray suit that looked completely out of place in a roadside diner at nearly midnight. His hair was perfectly combed despite the rain outside. Thin metal glasses sat on a sharp nose. Expensive shoes, now wet with rainwater, clicked against the linoleum floor. But it wasn't his appearance that set off every alarm in Garrett's head. It was the way he moved. Controlled. Precise. Like a man who had done this before, whatever this was. He scanned the diner slowly, methodically, his eyes moving across the truck driver at the counter, the college kids by the window, Iris standing frozen beside Garrett's booth. Then his gaze locked onto Garrett and the elderly woman kneeling beside his table. The man's expression didn't change. No surprise, no confusion, just a cold, calculating assessment. In that instant, Garrett made a decision. He didn't know who this woman was. He didn't know who the man in the suit was. He didn't know what kind of trouble he was about to step into. But he knew fear when he saw it. And the fear radiating from the woman beside him wasn't something you could fake. Garrett sighed quietly, then slid over in the booth and patted the cracked red vinyl seat beside him. "Grandma," he said loud enough for the entire diner to hear his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "I told you not to wander off in this weather. You had me worried sick." The old woman didn't hesitate. She climbed into the booth beside him, with surprising speed, wrapping her thin arm around his and pressing close, like she had known him her entire life. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she said softly, playing along with perfect timing, her voice trembling but steady. "I just needed some air. The storm confused me." Across the diner floor, the man in the gray suit stopped walking. His polite professional expression froze on his face as he stared at the unlikely pair sitting together in the back booth. An elderly woman and a massive biker with a skull patch on his back pretending to be family. Garrett lifted his coffee mug and took a slow sip, never breaking eye contact with the stranger. The message was simple and clear. Whatever game you came here to play tonight, you're not playing it alone anymore. The man in the gray suit stood perfectly still for 3 long seconds, rain dripping from his expensive shoes onto the diner floor. Then, as if he'd made some internal calculation, he began walking toward them again. Each step was deliberate, controlled, the walk of a man who was used to getting what he wanted through sheer force of will and professional intimidation. The truck driver at the counter had lifted his head, now suddenly wide awake, watching with the kind of cautious awareness that came from a lifetime of knowing when to mind your own business and when to pay very close attention. The college kids had stopped whispering entirely. Even the background hum of the diner seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of rain hammering the roof and the quiet click of expensive shoes on linoleum. The stranger stopped beside Garrett's table and offered a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I apologize for the interruption," he said smoothly, his voice controlled and professional, the kind of voice used by lawyers and corporate executives who were accustomed to being obeyed. "But I believe there's been a misunderstanding." He gestured toward the elderly woman sitting pressed against Garrett's side. "This woman is my mother. She suffers from occasional confusion and has a tendency to wander when she's upset. I've been searching for her for the past hour." The old woman stiffened beside Garrett, her hand tightening around his arm like she was gripping a lifeline. Garrett didn't move. He simply leaned back in the booth and studied the man the same way the man was studying him. "That's so," Garrett said slowly. It wasn't a question. The stranger nodded politely and reached into his pocket. For a split second, Garrett's muscles tensed instinctively, his body preparing for violence. But the man only pulled out his phone and tapped the screen before holding it up for Garrett to see. "Here," he said, turning the phone toward Garrett. "Proof." And the photograph showed the same elderly woman standing beside the suited man outside what looked like a large house with white columns. She was smiling in the photo, wearing a clean floral dress and a pearl necklace, her hair neatly styled. On the surface, it looked convincing. But Garrett Briggs had spent most of his adult life reading people learning to spot lies in the tension of a jaw or the flicker of an eye. And something about this photo didn't sit right. The woman beside him was trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. The woman in the photo looked calm post-stage. Garrett lowered his gaze to the old woman and spoke quietly so only she could hear. "You know this man?" She shook her head so violently it looked painful. Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. "No," she whispered. "I've never seen him before in my life. He's lying." Garrett slowly returned his attention to the suited man. "Funny thing," he said, setting his coffee mug down on the table with deliberate care. "My grandmother says she doesn't know you." The man's polite smile tightened just barely. Not anger yet, but it was getting there. "Sir, I'm certain you're trying to be helpful. But this is a private family matter. My mother has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, stage 3. She often forgets who people are, including her own family." "Is that right?" Garrett said flatly. "I'm afraid so." The man's tone remained calm, reasonable, the voice of someone explaining a simple misunderstanding to a child. "I have her medical records in the car if you'd like to see them. But really, this has gone on long enough. Mother, it's time to come home." He extended his hand toward the woman. She pressed herself harder against Garrett, shaking her head frantically. "I'm not going anywhere with him." The suited man sighed as if dealing with a particularly difficult toddler. He looked at Garrett with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and condescending at the same time. "You seem like a decent man," he said. "I'm sure you understand how difficult it is to care for an aging parent with dementia. But you're making this situation more complicated than it needs to be." He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice to something almost friendly. "Let the woman come with me, and you can get back to your coffee and your ride. No harm done." The old woman's grip on Garrett's arm had become almost painful. He could feel her entire body shaking, could hear the rapid, frightened rhythm of her breathing. "I'm not going," she whispered again, louder this time. "He'll kill me, just like they killed Harold." The suited man's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Garrett exhaled slowly, then pushed himself to his feet. The booth creaked as he unfolded to his full height, towering over the stranger by nearly half a foot. The fluorescent lights above reflected off the chrome rings on Garrett's fingers, the thick steel chain attached to his wallet, the iron reaper patch that covered his entire back. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Garrett leaned down just slightly, so their faces were level, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of absolute finality. You heard the lady. She doesn't want to go. The man studied Garrett with narrowed eyes, the mask of politeness finally slipping. You have no idea who you're interfering with. Garrett shrugged. Probably not. He glanced briefly out the window. Another vehicle had just pulled into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the rain. A second black SUV parking beside the first. The suited man glanced toward it too, just for a split second, and that was enough to confirm what Garrett already suspected. This guy hadn't come alone. The stranger looked back at Garrett and smiled thinly, confidence returning to his voice. I'm trying to be reasonable here, but you're forcing my hand. Garrett chuckled under his breath, a sound with no humor in it. Buddy, you picked the wrong diner for that speech. Behind the suited man, the diner door opened again as two large men stepped inside. Both wore dark jackets despite the desert heat. Both had the same blank professional expression that Garrett had seen on enforcers and hired muscle his entire life. They positioned themselves quietly near the entrance, blocking the exit. The college kids quickly gathered their things and hurried toward the restroom, clearly deciding they wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. The truck driver slowly stood up from his stool and backed toward the kitchen door, his survival instincts telling him to get out of the line of fire. Iris stood frozen behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone. The suited man spread his hand slightly, presenting the situation to Garrett like a business proposal. Last chance, he said. Step aside, let me take my mother home, and everyone walks out of here without any trouble. Garrett looked down at the elderly woman in the booth. She stared up at him with eyes full of helpless terror, the kind of fear that came from knowing you were completely alone in the world and that no one was coming to save you. And something in that look reached past all of Garrett's carefully constructed walls, past the armor he'd built from leather and chrome and 30 years of refusing to care too much about anything. Because he knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror every day for 6 months after Anna died. The look of someone drowning and unable to find the surface. Garrett turned back to the suited man. Not happening, he said simply. The stranger's eyes darkened. Outside, the engines of both SUVs continued to idle in the rain, a low mechanical rumble that vibrated faintly through the diner's windows. And in the distance, far down the empty highway, a new sound began to rise through the night air. A deep rhythmic thunder that Garrett recognized instantly that made something loosen in his chest, even as the tension in the diner ratcheted higher. The unmistakable roar of multiple motorcycle engines growing louder with every passing second. The suited man hadn't noticed it yet. He was too focused on Garrett, too confident in his numbers, too certain that 2 SUVs and 3 men were enough to handle one biker and a confused old woman. But Garrett had noticed. And suddenly the odds didn't feel quite so uneven anymore. The man in the gray suit opened his mouth to speak again, probably to make another threat or another reasonable-sounding argument. But the words died in his throat as the sound from the highway grew impossible to ignore. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling across the desert. Then it grew louder, deeper, a mechanical roar that made the glasses on the counter tremble and sent vibrations through the diner floor. Everyone turned toward the windows. Headlights appeared at the far end of Highway 50, cutting through the rain like glowing spears. Not 1 or 2, but dozens of them, a line of light stretching back into the darkness. The roar became deafening, and the motorcycle after motorcycle turned into the Desert Star parking lot, their engines echoing off the aluminum walls of the diner in a symphony of raw power. Chrome flashed under the flickering neon sign. Leather vests glistened with rain. 18 bikes filled the lot in less than 30 seconds, parking in tight formation around the 2 black SUVs like wolves surrounding prey. The suited man's confident expression cracked for the first time, uncertainty flickering across his face. Garrett leaned slightly closer to him and spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm. Those would be my friends. The diner door swung open and the first rider stepped inside. He was enormous, easily 300 pounds with a barrel chest and arms thick as tree trunks. Tattoos covered both forearms in a patchwork of faded ink that told the story of a long, hard life. His beard was shot through with gray, and his eyes carried the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of leading men who didn't follow easily. The Iron Reaper patch on his back was identical to Garrett's, except for the words President stitched above the skull. Luther Kane. Behind him, 4 more bikers filed into the diner, filling the small space with the smell of wet leather and gasoline and road dust. They positioned themselves casually around the room, not threatening, just present. Luther pulled off his riding gloves slowly, his gaze moving from the suited man to the 2 enforcers by the door to Garrett standing beside the booth. Steele, he said, using Garrett's road name. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel grinding under tires. You call for backup, or did we just happen to arrive at exactly the right time? Garrett gestured toward the elderly woman in the booth. Lady needed some help. Seemed like the polite thing to do. Luther's eyes softened as he looked at her. He nodded once, a gesture of respect. Well then, looks like we're in the right place. The suited man cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern, but this is a private family matter. That woman is my mother and she needs medical attention. I'm simply trying to take her home. One of the bikers behind Luther laughed a sharp bark of disbelief. Another cracked his knuckles. Luther folded his massive arms across his chest and studied the stranger with the kind of cold assessment usually reserved for enemies. Funny thing, he said slowly, she doesn't look like she wants to go with you. The old woman shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face now. Please don't let him take me. Please. And then she said something that made the entire room go completely silent. They killed my husband, she said, her voice trembling, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Harold found their records. He found everything, and they murdered him for it. The words hung in the air like smoke. The suited man's face hardened, the last traces of politeness evaporating. That's enough, he snapped. But the damage was done. Luther took a step forward, placing himself between the stranger and the booth. I think the lady's done talking to you. Outside, more engines rumbled. The 18 bikes that had arrived weren't idling quietly anymore. Their riders had dismounted and were standing in the rain, a wall of leather and chrome between the diner and the two SUVs. The suited man looked toward the window, calculating. His two enforcers near the door exchanged uneasy glances. One of the bikers behind Luther pulled out a cell phone and casually started dialing, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. Yeah, this is Jonas Riley calling for the Carson City Sheriff. We've got a situation at the Desert Star Diner on Highway 50. Some guys here trying to take an elderly woman against her will. Might want to send a unit. The suited man clenched his jaw. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then finally, he took a slow step backward. This isn't finished, he said quietly, his eyes locked on Garrett. Garrett tilted his head slightly. Sure sounds like it is. In the distance, barely audible over the rain and the idling motorcycles, the faint wail of sirens began to rise. Someone else had already called the authorities. Probably Iris, Garrett realized, glancing at the phone in her hand behind the counter. The two enforcers by the door looked at their boss, waiting for instructions. The suited man's hands curled into fists, but he was smart enough to know when he was beaten. He turned and walked toward the exit, pausing in the doorway to look back at Garrett one last time. You have no idea what you just stepped into, he said. No idea at all. Then he disappeared into the rain. His two men followed. The SUV engines roared to life, headlights sweeping across the diner windows as both vehicles pulled out of the parking lot. They disappeared down the highway just as two sheriff's patrol cars arrived, their red and blue lights cutting through the storm. For a moment, the only sound was the rain hammering the roof and the quiet rumble of 18 Harley engines slowly winding down. Then Luther let out a long breath and turned to Garrett. You want to tell me what the hell that was about? Garrett looked down at the elderly woman in the booth. She was still crying, but the terror in her eyes had faded to exhaustion. She looked small and fragile and utterly spent. I don't know yet, Garrett said honestly, but I think we're about to find out. The sheriff's deputies took statements for nearly an hour. Dorothy Whitmore sat in the booth with a blanket wrapped around her thin shoulders, her hands trembling around a cup of hot tea that Iris had brought her. She answered their questions in a quiet, shaking voice, telling them about Harold, about Silver Point Development, about the men who had been following her. The deputies wrote everything down with the kind of professional detachment that suggested they'd heard 1,000 stories like this before and believed maybe half of them. They asked for proof. They asked for documentation. They asked if she had any family they could call. Dorothy had neither proof nor family, just her word and the terror still lingering in her eyes. Garrett stood near the counter with Luther watching the scene unfold, his arms crossed over his chest. The other Iron Reaper members had moved outside, standing in a loose circle around their bikes despite the rain, a silent wall of protection that sent a clear message to anyone watching. This woman was under their protection now. One of the deputies, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, approached Garrett with a notepad. Mr. Briggs, the woman claims you're her grandson, but her records show she only had one daughter deceased 22 years ago. No grandchildren. Can you explain that? Garrett met the deputy's eyes steadily. She asked me to pretend to be family. She was scared. I helped. That's all. And the men who were here, the ones in the SUVs, never seen them before in my life. The deputy studied Garrett's face, clearly trying to decide if he was telling the truth or simply knew how to lie convincingly. Finally, he sighed and closed his notepad. Mrs. Whitmore is free to go. We'll file a report about the incident. If those men contact her again, she should call us immediately. Luther made a sound that might have been a laugh or a grunt of disbelief. Yeah, I'm sure that'll stop them. The deputy shot him a warning look but didn't respond. He and his partner left a few minutes later, their patrol cars pulling back onto the highway and disappearing into the rain. The diner felt too quiet after they left. Iris locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, even though it was barely past midnight. She moved around the space, wiping down tables and refilling coffee pots, the kind of busy work people did when they needed to process something difficult. Dorothy hadn't moved from the booth. She sat hunched over her tea, staring at nothing, her face pale and drawn. Garrett slid into the seat across from her. She looked up slowly, and when their eyes met, she started crying again. Not the terrified sobbing from before, but a quieter, deeper grief that came from a place beyond words. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for dragging you into this. I didn't know where else to turn. I've been running for 2 weeks, sleeping in my car, too scared to go to a hotel because I thought they'd find me. And when I walked into this diner and saw you, she shook her head. You look so much like David, my son-in-law. He had your build, your eyes. He died in a car accident with my daughter Rebecca 22 years ago. And for just a moment, I thought maybe God had sent me someone who could help. Garrett didn't know what to say to that. He'd never thought of himself as someone God sent to help people. Usually he was the kind of man mothers warn their children to avoid. Tell me what happened, he said quietly, from the beginning, and tell me the truth. Dorothy took a shaky breath and wrapped her hands tighter around the teacup. Harold was my husband, she began. We were married for 50 years. He worked as an accountant for Silver Point Development Corporation for 22 years. It was a good job, stable. He handled their books, their property acquisitions, their financial records. He was proud of his work. She paused, her eyes distant. But last spring something changed. Harold started coming home late, looking worried. He wouldn't tell me what was wrong at first. Just said there were some irregularities in the accounts that he needed to investigate. But as the weeks went by, he got more and more frightened. He stopped sleeping. He started carrying all his files in a locked briefcase. He wouldn't let me touch his computer. What did he find? Luther asked, pulling up a chair beside Garrett. Dorothy's voice dropped to barely a whisper. 15 years of money laundering. $340 million moved through fake property deals and shell companies. Silver Point wasn't just a development corporation. They were washing drug money for a Mexican cartel, funneling it through real estate purchases across Nevada and California. The diner was completely silent except for the rain on the roof. Harold copied everything, Dorothy continued. Every transaction, every fake deed, every shell company. He put it all on a USB drive. He was going to turn it over to the FBI. He had an appointment scheduled for July 23rd. Her hands began to shake harder. But on July 20th, at 3:17 in the morning, Harold died. The police said he fell asleep at the wheel driving home from a late meeting and drove off the road into a ravine. But Harold never fell asleep while driving. Never. And when I saw his body at the morgue, she closed her eyes. There were bruises on his neck, dark marks like someone had grabbed him. I told the police. They said the bruises were from the accident, but I know what I saw. Garrett leaned forward. Where's the USB drive now? Dorothy shook her head. I don't know. Harold told me he hid it somewhere safe, somewhere they'd never think to look. But he died before he could tell me where. I searched everywhere. Our house, his office, our safety deposit box. Nothing. What about his computer, his files? All gone. 2 days after the funeral, someone broke into our house and took Harold's computer, his briefcase, all his files. They made it look like a burglary, even stole some jewelry to make it convincing. But I knew what they were really after. Luther rubbed his beard thoughtfully. And that's when you realized you were in danger. I found cameras, Dorothy whispered, hidden in my house, in the bedroom, the kitchen, the bathroom. They were watching me, waiting to see if Harold had told me anything before he died. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police because Harold said some of them were on Silver Point's payroll. I couldn't call the FBI because I didn't have any proof. So I ran. She looked at Garrett with eyes full of desperate hope. But before I left, I found something. A letter. Harold had hidden it in a place he knew I'd eventually look inside our wedding photo album. The letter said that if anything happened to him, I should go to the Wells Fargo Bank in Reno. He has a safety deposit box there, that I didn't know about. He said everything I needed would be inside. Garrett exchanged a glance with Luther. When does the bank open, boy? Sunday morning, 9 o'clock. Dorothy's voice broke. But I can't go back there. That man, the one in the suit, he'll be watching. He'll kill me before I ever get inside. No, Garrett said firmly. He won't. Luther stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow across the booth. Steele's right. You're under Iron Reaper protection now. Nobody touches you. Nobody. Dorothy looked between them, confusion and gratitude warring on her face. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Garrett thought about that question. He thought about Caleb, about the wedding he wasn't invited to, about 12 years of silence and regret. He thought about Anna, about the way she used to look at him when he came home from work, like he was someone worth believing in. And he thought about standing outside a church in 3 days, watching his son get married from a distance, invisible and unwanted. Because someone should, he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than he'd intended. Dorothy reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. Iris approached his table carrying plates of food that no one had ordered. Eggs, bacon toast, hash browns. She set them down in front of Dorothy and Garrett without a word. You need to eat, she said gently to Dorothy. Can't run on empty. Dorothy nodded and picked up a fork with trembling hands. Garrett stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where the Iron Reaper members stood guard in the rain. Luther followed him. Sunday's 3 days away, Luther said quietly. That's a long time to keep her safe. I know. And Sunday's also my son's wedding. I know that too. Luther was silent for a moment. Then he put a hand on Garrett's shoulder. Danny died for doing the right thing. He stood up to some corrupt sheriff trying to shake down local businesses, and they ran him off the road for it. Made it look like an accident, just like they did to this lady's husband. He squeezed Garrett's shoulder. We couldn't save Danny, but we can save her. Garrett nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They stood there together, watching the rain until a sound made them both turn. Dorothy had pulled something from inside her coat. A silver pocket watch, old and tarnished with an ornate cover. She set it on the table, her fingers tracing the engraving on the lid. Garrett and Luther moved back to the booth. What's that? Garrett asked. Harold's watch, Dorothy said softly. It was his grandfather's. He carried it every day for 40 years. It stopped working the night he died, 3:17 in the morning. I haven't been able to wind it since. It's like time stopped for both of us. She opened the watch carefully. Inside was a faded photograph tucked beneath the clock face. A young couple on their wedding day, both impossibly young and smiling at each other like they'd just discovered the meaning of happiness. 50 years, Dorothy whispered. We had 50 good years, and they took them from me over money, over greed. Garrett stared at the photograph, at the way the young Harold looked at his bride, and felt something crack open inside his chest. That was what love looked like. That was what he'd had with Anna. That was what he'd thrown away in his grief. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Caleb's name on the screen. A text message sent at 1:15 in the morning. Dad, I know you're coming to Reno. Abigail's mom saw your name on the hotel registry. Please don't. I don't want you there. I don't want to explain to her family why my father is a biker who abandoned me. Just stay away, please. The words hit harder than any punch Garrett had ever taken. Luther read the message over his shoulder and swore quietly. Kid doesn't pull his punches. He's right, though, Garrett said, his voice hollow. I did abandon him, and now he's paying for it. He started to put the phone away, but Dorothy reached out and stopped him. Call him, she said. What? Call your son, right now. It's 1 in the morning. He won't. Call him, Dorothy repeated more firmly this time. Trust me. Garrett hesitated, then pressed the call button. The phone rang 4 times before Caleb answered, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. What do you want? I got your message, Garrett said. And you're right. You're right about all of it. I was a terrible father. I abandoned you when you needed me most. I chose my own grief over being there for you. And I don't blame you for not wanting me at your wedding. Silence on the other end. But I need you to know something. Garrett continued, his throat tight. Your mother was the best thing that ever happened to me. And you are the second best thing, and I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I don't deserve to be part of your life, but I'm going to spend the rest of my days trying to be the man your mother believed I could be, even if you never see it, even if you never want to. More silence. Then quietly, why are you telling me this now? At 1 in the morning, Garrett looked at Dorothy, at the old woman who'd lost everything and was still fighting. Because I just met someone who reminded me that it's never too late to do the right thing. And the right thing is telling you the truth, even if it doesn't change anything. He could hear Caleb breathing on the other end of the line. I'm not coming to the wedding, Garrett said. I won't embarrass you, but I want you to know that I'll be thinking about you. And I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the man you became despite having me as a father. Dad, Caleb's voice cracked slightly. Be happy, son. That's all I want. Just be happy. Garrett ended the call before Caleb could respond, before the emotion building in his chest could break through. He set the phone down on the table and took a deep breath. Dorothy was smiling at him, tears running down her weathered cheeks. That was brave. That was stupid, Garrett corrected, but it needed to be said. Luther cleared his throat. So what's the plan? We can't keep her here. That suit's gonna come back, probably with more men. Garrett thought for a moment. We need to get her somewhere safe until Sunday, somewhere they won't think to look. The clubhouse, Luther suggested. Carson City. We've got security cameras and 20 brothers who'd love an excuse to crack some corporate skulls. But Garrett shook his head. Too obvious. If they've been watching her, they probably know about us now. They'll check every MC clubhouse in Nevada. Iris, who had been listening quietly from behind the counter, spoke up. She can stay with me. Everyone turned to look at her. I've got a house 10 miles from here, Iris continued. Small place off the grid. My daughter Nora and I live there alone. Nobody knows about it except locals. If you're worried about safety, I've got my father's shotgun and I know how to use it. Dorothy looked at Iris with something like wonder. You'd do that for a stranger. You're not a stranger, Iris said simply. You're someone who needs help. And 8 years ago, a stranger helped my father when he needed it most. She looked at Garrett. Time to pay that forward. Garrett felt something loosen in his chest, some tight knot of cynicism that had been there so long he'd forgotten it existed. Okay, he said. Dorothy stays with Iris. Luther, I need you to post guards. Rotating shifts, 2 men at a time, watching the house from a distance. If anyone even drives down that road who doesn't belong there, I want to know about it. Luther nodded. Done. And I need someone to check out Silver Point Development. See what we can find out about their operation, who runs it, what kind of security they have. I'll make some calls, Luther said. Got a few brothers who work construction and contracting. Someone will know something. Garrett turned back to Dorothy. Sunday morning we go to the bank, together. We get what Harold left for you and then we take it straight to the FBI. No stops, no detours. We end this. Dorothy nodded, hope flickering in her tired eyes. But before anyone could say anything else, Garrett's phone buzzed again. Another text from Caleb. Where are you right now? Garrett stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Finally, he typed back, Desert Star Diner, Highway 50, why? The response came 30 seconds later. I'm in Reno. I can be there in 2 hours. We need to talk, face to face. Garrett's hands went numb. He read the message 3 times, convinced he was misunderstanding. Luther leaned over and read it too. Well, damn, he said quietly. Guess prayers do get answered sometimes. He probably just wants to yell at me in person, Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction. Only one way to find out. Dorothy said, that small smile still on her face. You told him the truth. Now let him tell you his. The next 2 hours passed in a strange, suspended reality. Iris made more coffee and food that no one ate. The Iron Reaper members rotated in and out of the diner, warming up, drying off, then heading back outside to maintain their watch. Dorothy dozed in the booth, exhaustion finally overwhelming fear. Garrett sat by the window and watched the highway. At 3:45 in the morning, headlights appeared in the distance. A silver Honda Civic, driving carefully through the rain, slowed as it approached the diner. It pulled into the parking lot and parked near the entrance. The driver's door opened, and Caleb Briggs stepped out into the rain. He was 27 years old, tall and lean with dark hair and the kind of clean-cut appearance that came from working in corporate offices. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, now getting soaked, and he looked nervous and determined in equal measure. Garrett stood up slowly, his heart hammering. Caleb walked to the diner door and pulled it open. The bell chimed. Father and son stood there 10 feet apart, staring at each other across a distance that felt like miles. Hi, Dad, Caleb said quietly. It was the first time he'd called Garrett Dad in 12 years. Hi, son, Garrett managed, his voice rough. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Caleb took a deep breath. I got in my car and started driving before I could talk myself out of it, he said. Abigail thinks I'm crazy. She's probably right, But I've been carrying this anger for so long, and when you called tonight and said those things, he shook his head. I realized I didn't want to get married with all this weight still between us. Garrett didn't move, afraid that if he did, this fragile moment would shatter. I'm still angry, Caleb continued. I'm angry that you weren't there when Mom died. I'm angry that I had to grow up without a father. I'm angry that I had to learn how to be a man by watching other people's dads instead of my own. Each word landed like a stone in Garrett's chest. But I'm also tired, Caleb said, and his voice cracked. I'm tired of being angry. I'm tired of pretending I don't care. And I'm tired of looking at wedding photos and seeing this empty space where you should be standing. Tears were running down Caleb's face now, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. So I drove here to tell you that I don't forgive you. Not yet, maybe not ever, but I want to try. I want to see if we can build something from all this wreckage. Because Abigail's pregnant dad, 3 months, and I don't want my kid to grow up without a grandfather the way I grew up without a father. The words hit Garrett like a freight train. A grandchild. He was going to be a grandfather. Something broke open inside him, 12 years of carefully constructed walls crumbling all at once. Garrett crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled his son into a crushing embrace. Caleb stiffened for just a moment, then his arms came up and he hugged his father back, both of them crying and now, both of them holding on like they were drowning. I'm sorry, Garrett said into his son's shoulder. I'm so sorry for all of it. I know, Caleb whispered back. I know you are. They stood there in the middle of the Desert Star Diner at 4 in the morning, holding each other and letting 12 years of silence finally break. When they finally pulled apart, Luther was wiping his eyes. Iris was crying openly. Even Dorothy had woken up and was watching with a trembling smile. Caleb looked around the diner, taking in the bikers, the old woman, the locked doors, and the air of siege. What the hell is going on here? Garrett laughed, a sound of pure relief. It's a long story. I've got time, Caleb said. So Garrett told him everything. About Dorothy, about Harold, about Silver Point Development, and the USB drive hidden in a bank vault, and the men in suits who tried to take her. Caleb listened to it all, his expression shifting from confusion to concern to something that looked almost like pride. So let me get this straight, he said when Garrett finished. You're protecting a woman you just met from corporate hitmen, and you're planning to raid a bank vault on Sunday morning, which is also the morning of my wedding. I won't be at the wedding, Garrett said quickly. I told you I'm not going to. The wedding starts at 11, Caleb interrupted. The bank opens at 9. That gives you 2 hours. If you're fast, you can do both. Garrett stared at his son. You want me to come? I want you to be there, Caleb said. Not in the back row, not hiding outside. I want you standing beside me. If you're willing to risk your life for a stranger, the least I can do is make room for you at my wedding. And then Caleb smiled, a real smile, the kind Garrett hadn't seen since his son was a little boy. Besides, Abigail's going to want to meet the grandfather of her baby. Might as well start with the wedding. Garrett couldn't speak. He just pulled Caleb into another hug, this one gentler, full of gratitude and hope, and the promise of something better. When they finally separated, Dorothy was standing beside the booth, leaning heavily on Iris for support. Young man, she said to Caleb, your father is a good man. Don't ever forget that. Caleb looked at Garrett, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in 12 years. I'm starting to remember, he said softly. Outside, the rain was finally beginning to ease. The storm was passing, leaving behind clean air and the promise of dawn. Luther clapped Garrett on the shoulder. Looks like you got your miracle brother. Yeah, Garrett said, watching his son talk quietly with Dorothy, explaining to her about the baby, about the wedding, about second chances. Yeah, I think I did. But as the first gray light of morning touched the horizon, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was still ahead. Because somewhere in Reno, Vincent Crane was making plans of his own. And Sunday was still 3 days away. The sun rose over Nevada on Sunday morning in shades of orange and gold, painting the desert in colors that promised either salvation or judgment, depending on which side of the law you stood. Garrett Briggs hadn't slept. He sat on the porch of Iris Calloway's small house, watching the horizon lighten, a cup of black coffee growing cold in his hands. Behind him, through the screen door, he could hear the quiet sounds of people waking up. Dorothy's soft footsteps in the guest room. Iris moving around the kitchen. Nora Iris's 14-year-old daughter humming something while she got ready for school. 3 days had passed since that stormy night at the Desert Star Diner. 3 days of waiting, of planning, of watching the road for black SUVs that never came. But the silence hadn't brought peace. It had brought something worse, the weight of knowing that Vincent Crane was out there somewhere planning his next move. Luther had kept guards posted around the clock, rotating shifts of Iron Reaper members who sat on their bikes in the distance, eyes always on the house. If Vincent or anyone from Silver Point Development had tried to approach directly, they would have seen them coming from a mile away. But Vincent Crane hadn't gotten to where he was by being predictable. On Friday afternoon, one of Luther's contacts at a construction company had called with information. Silver Point Development owned 17 properties in the Reno area, including an old warehouse on Industrial Road that had been abandoned for 2 years. Security cameras around the property had been reactivated 3 days ago. On Saturday morning, Caleb had driven out to see his father one last time before the wedding. He'd sat on the same porch nervous about the ceremony, about introducing Abigail to Garrett, about everything that could go wrong. Garrett had told him to go back to Reno to stay with Abigail, to focus on getting married, and let the Iron Reaper handle Dorothy's protection. Caleb had refused, said he wanted to be there when they went to the bank, said family stuck together. Now watching the Sunday sunrise, Garrett wished he'd insisted harder. The screen door creaked open and Caleb stepped out onto the porch. He was already dressed for the wedding, wearing dark slacks and a white shirt with the tie hanging loose around his neck. He looked tired. The past 3 days had been a crash course in understanding his father's world, and it had shaken something loose in the careful distance Caleb had maintained for 12 years. Couldn't sleep either, Caleb asked, sitting down on the porch step beside Garrett. Didn't try, Garrett admitted. Too much on my mind. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, something that would have been impossible just days ago. The anger between them hadn't disappeared completely. It probably never would. But it had softened into something more manageable, more honest. You don't have to do this, you know, Caleb said quietly. Dorothy could go to the bank with Luther. You could just come straight to the church. Let someone else take the risk. Garrett shook his head. She asked me, not Luther, not the club, Mikio. I gave her my word. Even if it means you might miss my wedding. The bank opens at 9. The wedding starts at 11. Wells Fargo is 20 minutes from St. Patrick's Cathedral. We'll have plenty of time. Caleb smiled faintly. You're assuming everything goes according to plan. Things never go according to plan, Garrett said. But we plan anyway because it's better than walking in blind. The door opened again and Dorothy emerged wearing a simple blue dress that Iris had given her. She looked stronger than she had 3 nights ago. The terror had faded from her eyes, replaced by something harder. Determination. The kind that came from deciding you'd already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to fear. Good morning, she said softly, joining them on the porch. Beautiful sunrise, boy. Yes, ma'am, Garrett agreed. Dorothy looked at Caleb, then back at Garrett. Your son should be with his bride this morning, not worrying about an old woman's problems. I'm exactly where I need to be, Caleb said firmly. And you're not a problem, Mrs. Whitmore. You're family now. Dad made you family when he helped you, which means you're my family too. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. Your mother raised a good man. My mother raised a great man, Garrett corrected quietly. I just got in the way for a while. Iris appeared in the doorway, car keys in hand. Nora's ready for school. I'll drop her off and meet you at the diner. Luther and the others should be there by 8:30. The plan was simple, at least on paper. At 8:30, the Iron Reaper members would gather at the Desert Star Diner, creating a visible presence on Highway 50. At 8:45, Garrett, Dorothy, Luther, and 4 other riders would leave for Reno in a tight convoy. They would arrive at Wells Fargo at 9 o'clock sharp when the doors open. Dorothy would access the safety deposit box, retrieve whatever Harold had left for her, and they would immediately drive to the FBI field office on Sierra Street. By 10:15, Dorothy would be in federal protection, and the evidence would be in the right hands. By 10:45, Garrett would be standing beside his son at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Simple, clean, safe. Garrett didn't believe in any of it, but he smiled and nodded and pretended confidence he didn't feel, because Dorothy needed to believe that everything would be all right and Caleb needed to believe his father had things under control. At 7:30, Caleb hugged his father, climbed into his Honda Civic, and headed back to Reno. He had to pick up his tuxedo, meet with the priest one final time, and be at the church by 10:30 for photos. Garrett watched the taillights disappear down the road and felt something twist in his chest. He told himself it was just nerves about the bank, about facing Vincent Crane again, about keeping Dorothy safe. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was the feeling he'd learned to trust over 30 years of hard living. The one that whispered warnings when everything seemed too quiet. The one that had kept him alive through bar fights and bad deals and rides through territories where his patch made him a target. Something was wrong. He just didn't know what yet. At 8 o'clock, Garrett went inside to change. He pulled on a clean pair of jeans, a dark button-down shirt, and his leather cut with the Iron Reaper patch. Then he stopped and looked at himself in the mirror. The man staring back was 47 years old, with gray in his beard and lines around his eyes that told the story of a hard life. But for the first time in 12 years, he didn't look haunted. He looked like someone who had found his way back from the edge. His phone buzzed, a text from Luther. "Everyone's in position. Time to roll." Garrett took a deep breath, then walked back outside. Dorothy was waiting by the porch steps, her hands clasped together. She'd been clutching Harold's pocket watch for 3 days straight, winding it obsessively even though it refused to start. The hands were still frozen at 3:17, the moment her husband died. "Are you ready?" Garrett asked gently. She nodded, though her hands trembled. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked to his Harley together. Luther pulled up on his bike, followed by 4 other Iron Reaper members. The sound of their engines shattered the quiet morning, a mechanical thunder that sent birds scattering from nearby trees. "Stay close," Luther said to Dorothy as Garrett helped her onto the back of his bike. "Don't let go and trust steel to get you there safely." Dorothy wrapped her arms around Garrett's waist, and he felt how badly she was shaking. "It's going to be okay," he told her over his shoulder. "I've got you." The convoy pulled out at 8:45, exactly 6 motorcycles moving in tight formation down the empty highway. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert, and the air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and creosote. For 20 minutes they rode in silence. The highway stretched out before them, empty and straight, with nothing but desert on either side. Garrett kept his eyes moving, scanning the road ahead, the mirrors, the rocky outcroppings that could hide an ambush. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. Then 5 miles outside Reno, he saw them. 2 black SUVs parked on the side of the highway exactly where the road curved around a rocky outcropping that provided perfect cover. They weren't even trying to hide. "Luther," Garrett said into his radio headset, "we've got company." "I see them," Luther's voice crackled back. "Keep moving. Stay in formation." But as they approached, both SUVs pulled onto the highway behind them. Not aggressive, not speeding, just following, maintaining a steady distance of about 50 yards. They weren't hiding anymore. They were making a statement. "Faster," Luther ordered. The motorcycles accelerated, engines roaring as they pushed toward Reno, but the SUVs matched their speed easily, closing the distance with the effortless power of vehicles that had twice the horsepower. Dorothy's grip tightened around Garrett's waist. "They're going to stop us," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Not if I can help it," Garrett growled. The Reno city limits appeared ahead, buildings rising from the desert like a promise of safety. Traffic began to thicken. Sunday morning commuters heading to church, families going out for breakfast. The SUVs couldn't do anything too aggressive here. Not with witnesses, not in broad daylight, but they didn't need to. As the convoy reached downtown Reno, both SUVs suddenly accelerated, engines roaring, as they cut in front of the motorcycles and slammed on their brakes in a coordinated maneuver that spoke of military training. Luther swerved hard left, barely avoiding a collision. The other riders scattered, trying to maintain control as their bikes skidded and swerved. Garrett pulled hard to the right, his Harley jumping the curb and skidding onto the sidewalk. Dorothy screamed but held on, her arms locked around his waist like iron bands. Men poured out of the SUVs before the vehicles had fully stopped. Not 2 or 3 this time. 8 of them, all wearing dark suits that barely concealed the weapons underneath, all moving with the kind of precision that came from working together for a long time. And standing in the middle of them, perfectly calm, perfectly composed, was Vincent Crane. He looked different in daylight. The polite corporate mask was still there, but underneath it, Garrett could see something else now. Something cold and patient and absolutely certain of victory. "Mrs. Whitmore." Vincent called out, his voice carrying across the street with the practiced projection of someone used to commanding rooms. "This ends now. Give me what Harold hid, and you walk away. Fight me, and people get hurt." Luther and the other Iron Reaper members had dismounted, forming a wall between Dorothy and Vincent's men. Garrett helped Dorothy off the bike, keeping her behind him, his body positioned between her and Vincent. "She's not giving you anything," Garrett said. Vincent smiled, but there was no warmth in it, no humor, just the cold satisfaction of a man playing a game he'd already won. "I was hoping you'd say that." He raised his hand and one of his men stepped forward, holding a tablet computer. Vincent took it, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward Garrett. "Live video feed. A warehouse interior, concrete floors, exposed beams, the kind of abandoned industrial space that dotted the outskirts of every American city. And tied to a chair in the middle of it, bloodied but conscious, was Caleb." Garrett's world stopped. The street noise faded. The morning sun seemed to dim. All he could see was his son, his boy tied and bleeding because Garrett had let him get too close to this. No, he whispered. Yes, Vincent said, his voice perfectly calm, perfectly reasonable. We took him at 7:45 this morning right outside his hotel. He'd gone for a walk to clear his head before the wedding. Poor timing on his part. His fiancée thinks he's at the church already getting ready. She's probably wondering why he's not answering his phone. Dorothy made a sound like a wounded animal. Luther swore viciously, his hands clenching into fists. Garrett couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could see was Caleb's face on that screen, bruised and swollen, one eye nearly shut, blood dried on his lip. And in that moment, Garrett understood with perfect clarity that Vincent Crane had never intended to let any of them walk away from this. The USB drive was secondary. This was about sending a message, about showing what happened to people who interfered with Silver Point Development's business. The USB drive, Vincent said, in exchange for your son, you have 10 minutes to decide. After that, my associate starts breaking bones. And I should mention Mr. Briggs that will start with his hands. I understand he works with computers. Be a shame if he couldn't type anymore. The tablet screen shifted. One of Vincent's men in the warehouse picked up a metal pipe, testing its weight, then walked toward Caleb with slow, deliberate steps. Wait, Garrett said, his voice breaking. Wait, don't hurt him. Vincent lowered the tablet slightly. Then make the right choice. Garrett looked at Dorothy. She was crying silently, her hands pressed to her mouth, her entire body shaking. I'm so sorry, she whispered. This is my fault. I never should have involved you. Your son shouldn't have to pay for my— Stop, Garrett said gently. This isn't your fault. This is on Vincent, on Silver Point, on the men who killed Harold, not on you. Luther stepped closer to Garrett, his voice low and urgent. We can find him. I've got 20 brothers in this city. Give me 30 minutes, we'll tear Reno apart until— He doesn't have 30 minutes, Garrett interrupted. His hands were shaking. His chest felt like it was being crushed in a vice. Vincent will kill him. You know that. I know that. So what do we do? Luther asked. Garrett looked at the Wells Fargo Bank across the street. The doors had just opened at 9 o'clock, right on schedule. Inside that building was the truth about Silver Point Development. Evidence that could put Vincent Crane and dozens of others in prison for decades. Evidence that Harold Whitmore had died protecting. Evidence that Dorothy had risked everything to preserve. And standing between Garrett and that evidence was an impossible choice that no father should ever have to make. Save his son or save the truth. Choose family or choose justice. He looked at Vincent Crane, at the man who had orchestrated Harold's murder, who had terrorized Dorothy, who now held Caleb's life in his hands like a bargaining chip in a game Garrett didn't know how to win. And Garrett made his decision. I'll get you the USB drive, he said quietly, but first you let me see my son. Real-time video, proof he's still alive right now. And you let Dorothy go. Vincent considered this for a moment, then shook his head. No, Dorothy stays until I have the drive, but I'll show you proof your son is alive. He tapped the tablet screen. The view changed to a close-up of Caleb's face. One of the men in the warehouse grabbed Caleb's hair and yanked his head back. Dad, Caleb said, his voice rough and slurred from the beating. Don't do it. Don't give them what they want. Let them— The man holding Caleb's hair slammed his fist into Caleb's stomach. Caleb doubled over, gasping. Enough proof, Vincent asked. Garrett's vision went red. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to launch himself across that street, to put his hands around Vincent Crane's throat and squeeze until the life left his eyes. But Luther's hand on his shoulder held him back, and the cold, rational part of Garrett's mind that had kept him alive for 47 years whispered that attacking Vincent now would get Caleb killed. So he swallowed his rage and turned to Dorothy. Where did Harold hide it? She was shaking her head frantically, tears streaming down her weathered face. You can't give it to him. Harold died for this. If we surrender it now, he died for nothing. All those people Silver Point hurt, they'll never get justice. It'll all be buried. Harold died for you, Garrett said gently, taking her hands in his. Not for a USB drive, and I'm not losing my son over this. I'm sorry, Dorothy, I can't make that sacrifice. But the evidence will mean nothing if Caleb dies, Garrett said, and I'll have to live the rest of my life knowing I chose revenge over my son. I can't do that. I won't. He started toward the bank, but Luther grabbed his arm. Think about this, Luther said urgently, keeping his voice low so Vincent couldn't hear. You give him that drive, he's got no reason to let anyone live. Not Caleb, Not Dorothy, not you. He'll kill all of us and bury the evidence. You know that's how this works. I know, Garrett said, but I have to try, because that's my son, and I've already failed him once. I won't do it again. He pulled free from Luther's grip and walked into the bank, Dorothy following close behind her, steps heavy with the weight of watching everything Harold died for slip away. Inside, the morning light streamed through tall windows, casting everything in shades of gold that seemed almost mockingly beautiful. A young bank clerk approached with a professional smile that faltered when she saw Dorothy's tear-streaked face. "How can I help you today?" "Safety deposit box," Dorothy said, her voice hollow and distant. "Box number 847, under the name Harold Whitmore." The clerk led them through the pristine lobby, past potted plants and marble floors, into the vault room. A secure space lined with metal boxes, each one holding someone's most precious possessions. Secrets and treasures and final wishes. Dorothy signed the access log with a trembling hand, her signature barely legible. Then she used the key she'd been carrying for 3 days to open box 847. Inside was a manila envelope, just as Harold had promised. Dorothy lifted it out slowly, reverently, like she was handling something sacred. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped it twice. Garrett took it from her gently. "Is this it?" She nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face. He opened the envelope. Inside was a USB drive, exactly as Dorothy had described. Small, black, ordinary looking. A piece of plastic and silicon that held the power to topple an empire. And beneath it, a letter in Harold's handwriting, the ink slightly faded but still perfectly legible. Dorothy took the letter and read it aloud, her voice breaking with every word. "My dearest Dorothy, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am so very sorry to leave you alone. I know how frightened you must be. I know how hard this journey has been. But please, my love, don't give up. This drive contains 15 years of evidence. 15 years of crimes that destroyed lives and families. If you give it to the FBI, specifically to Agent Catherine Brennan, they will use it to bring justice to people who thought themselves untouchable. I know I'm asking you to be brave when you're terrified. I know I'm asking you to fight when all you want to do is hide. But you are the strongest person I have ever known. You are my hero, and I know you will do the right thing even when it's the hardest thing. I love you more than 50 years could ever express. I am so sorry I cannot grow old with you, but I am so grateful I got to love you at all. Forever yours, Harold." Dorothy folded the letter carefully and pressed it to her chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Garrett stood there holding the USB drive, feeling its weight. Barely a few grams, but in that moment it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. This small piece of plastic held the truth, held justice, held the power to stop men like Vincent Crane from hurting anyone else. But his son was bleeding in a warehouse somewhere, waiting for rescue that wasn't coming. He couldn't save both. "I'm sorry," Garrett said to Dorothy. "I'm so sorry." He turned to walk out of the vault to hand the drive to Vincent, to trade justice for his son's life, and spend the rest of his days wondering if he'd made the right choice. But Dorothy grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Wait," she said. She took the USB drive from his hand, held it for a long moment, staring at it like she was memorizing every detail. Then she looked up at Garrett with eyes that had gone from terrified to determined. "Harold was right," she said quietly. "I am strong enough to do the right thing, even when it's the hardest thing." She pressed the USB drive back into Garrett's hand. "Make a copy," she said. "Give Vincent the original. Let him think he won, but we keep the copy, and we still go to the FBI." Garrett stared at her. "Dorothy, if he finds out—" "He won't," she said firmly, "because you're going to make him believe he got everything. You're going to save your son, and then we're going to finish what Harold started. Together." "There's a copy shop 2 blocks from here." Luther's voice came through Garrett's earpiece. He'd been listening through the open radio channel the whole time. "I'm heading there now. Meet me in 5 minutes." Garrett looked at Dorothy, at this 73-year-old woman who had lost everything and was still fighting. "You're sure?" he asked. "There's no going back from this." "I'm sure," she said. "Harold didn't die so we could surrender. He died so we could win. So let's win." 5 minutes later, Luther handed Garrett 2 identical USB drives in a Target parking lot, both still in their packaging. "Original and copy," he said, using a pocket knife to open the packages. "I watched them do it myself. Every file, every folder. Vincent gets the original. We keep the backup." Garrett took both drives, marked one with a tiny scratch on the corner that only he would notice, then slipped the backup into his boot. "If this goes wrong," he said to Luther, "you get Dorothy to the FBI, no matter what. Promise me. Luther's jaw tightened. You know I will, but it's not going wrong. We're all walking away from this. They walked back to where Vincent was waiting, his patience clearly wearing thin. The man had been checking his watch every 30 seconds, and his men had positioned themselves in a tighter circle around the Iron Reaper members. Do you have it? Vincent demanded. Garrett held up the USB drive. Right here. Now show me my son. Vincent gestured to one of his men who brought up the tablet again. Live feed of Caleb, still tied to the chair, still breathing, still alive. Release him, Garrett said. Drive first, Vincent replied. Son first. They stared at each other across the street, neither willing to blink first. The morning traffic continued around them, oblivious to the standoff happening on a sunny Reno street corner. Then Vincent smiled a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. Fine, a show of good faith. He made a call on his phone. On the tablet screen, one of the men in the warehouse cut Caleb's restraints. Caleb stood slowly swaying, but upright, his hands gripping the back of the chair for support. Now the drive, Vincent said, extending his hand. Garrett walked forward slowly, each step feeling like walking to his own execution. He placed the USB drive in Vincent's outstretched palm. Vincent examined it, turning it over, checking for any obvious signs of tampering. Then he plugged it into a laptop. One of his men held his eyes, never leaving the screen as he scrolled through files. Garrett's heart hammered. If they'd made any mistake in the copying process, if the file structure was different, if anything looked wrong, Vincent would know. 30 seconds passed, each one feeling like an hour. Then Vincent smiled, and this time there was genuine satisfaction in it. Everything's here, he said. Every transaction, every shell company, every piece of evidence, Harold so carefully compiled. Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Briggs. He ejected the drive, slipped it into his pocket, and turned to leave. Then he paused and looked back as if remembering something. Your son is at the old Silver Point warehouse on Industrial Road. You'll find him alive, mostly. I keep my promises, unlike some people. He climbed into the SUV, and his men followed. Within 30 seconds, both vehicles were gone, disappearing into Reno traffic like they'd never been there. Garrett stood there watching them go, every muscle in his body coiled tight. He wanted to believe it was over, that Vincent would keep his word, that Caleb would be safe. But 30 years of hard living had taught him that men like Vincent and Crane didn't keep their word unless it benefited them. Did he buy it? Luther asked quietly, moving to stand beside Garrett. He bought it, Garrett said. Now let's get Caleb. They mounted their bikes and rode hard for Industrial Road engines, screaming, weaving through traffic with the kind of reckless speed that came from knowing every second mattered. The warehouse was exactly where Vincent said it would be, an old Silver Point property abandoned for 2 years, surrounded by chain-link fence and warning signs about trespassing. Luther and 2 other riders peeled off to circle the building, checking for guards or traps. Garrett didn't wait. He kicked the door open, the rusted metal shrieking in protest, and rushed inside. The warehouse was vast, and empty sunlight streaming through broken windows high above dust motes dancing in the beams. And in the middle of all that empty space, sitting on the floor with his back against the chair they tied him to, was Caleb. The moment he saw his father, he started crying. Garrett crossed the distance in seconds and dropped to his knees, pulling his son into a crushing embrace, his hands running over Caleb's body, checking for serious injuries, relief flooding through him so powerfully it made him dizzy. I'm okay, Caleb kept saying, his voice rough and broken. Dad, I'm okay, I'm okay. We need to get you to a hospital, Garrett said, seeing the bruises, the swollen eye, the dried blood. No, Caleb said, firmly gripping his father's arms. We need to get me to my wedding. What time is it? Garrett checked his phone. 10:20. Then we have 40 minutes. Caleb struggled to his feet, swaying but determined. I didn't survive getting kidnapped by corporate thugs just to miss my own wedding. Now help me up. Against all reason, against every instinct telling him to get medical attention for his son, Garrett smiled. Caleb had inherited Anna's stubbornness, and in that moment, Garrett had never been more proud. At 10:55, Garrett Briggs walked through the doors of St. Patrick's Cathedral, wearing his Iron Reaper leather cut over a clean shirt, his son walking beside him, with a bandage on his forehead and determination in his eyes. Abigail rushed over from where she'd been waiting with her bridesmaids, her face going pale as she saw Caleb's injuries. But before she could speak, before she could ask what happened, Caleb pulled her into a kiss. Long story, he said when they separated. I'll tell you later. Right now, let us get married. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. Garrett stood beside his son watching Caleb marry the woman he loved and felt something break open inside his chest that he thought was dead forever. The priest's words washed over him, but all he could see was the way Caleb looked at Abigail, the same way Harold had looked at Dorothy in that faded wedding photo, the same way Garrett had once looked at Anna. When the priest said, "You may kiss the bride," and Caleb and Abigail sealed their vows, Garrett found himself crying. Not the quiet tears of sentiment, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his shoulders and wouldn't stop. Luther, standing beside him, put a hand on his shoulder and didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The Brotherhood understood. Afterward, at the reception held in the church hall, Abigail pulled Garrett aside while Caleb was changing his shirt to hide the worst of the bruises from the photographer. "Thank you," she said simply, "for saving him." "He's my son," Garrett said. "I'd do anything for him." "I know," Abigail said. "I can see that now. Caleb told me about the USB drive, about the choice you had to make. And I want you to know something." She placed a hand on her still flat stomach. "We're naming the baby after Caleb's mother, Anna. If it's a girl, and if it's a boy," she smiled, "we're naming him Garrett Harold Briggs, after two men who knew what it meant to sacrifice everything for the people they loved." Garrett couldn't speak. He just pulled his future daughter-in-law into a hug and let the tears come again. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Garrett, Dorothy, and Luther walked into the FBI field office on Sierra Street. Agent Catherine Brennan was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s with steel gray hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from 20 years of dealing with white-collar criminals who thought they were smarter than everyone else. She listened to their story without interruption, making notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression never changing. Then she took the copied USB drive and disappeared into a back office. An hour passed, then another. Finally, she emerged and her expression had changed. The professional mask had slipped, replaced by something that looked like barely controlled fury. "This is bigger than I thought," she said, sitting down across from them. "This isn't just Silver Point. This implicates state officials, judges, law enforcement officers in 3 counties. We're talking about a corruption network that goes back 15 years and touches every level of Nevada government." "Can you use it?" Dorothy asked, her voice small. "Can I use it?" Brennan repeated, leaning forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is enough to launch federal investigations in 3 states. RICO charges money laundering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. We'll have indictments within a month, arrests within 2 months. Your husband documented everything with the kind of precision that prosecutors dream about." Dorothy's knees buckled. Garrett caught her, helped her to a chair. "Harold's death meant something," she whispered. "It meant something." "Your husband was a hero," Brennan said quietly, "and so are you. What you did coming forward with this, knowing what it cost you, that took more courage than most people have in their entire lives." "What about Vincent Crane?" Garrett asked. "He has the original drive. He thinks he won." Brennan's smile was cold and sharp. "Let him think that. We don't need the original. Your copy is admissible as evidence, since we can verify it came from Mrs. Whitmore's safety deposit box. We've got bank records, your testimony, the deposit box access log. And while Mr. Crane is celebrating his victory, we'll be building cases against him and everyone else on that list." She stood up and extended her hand to Dorothy. "We'll put you in protective custody until the arrests are made, somewhere safe where Silver Point can't reach you." "How long?" Dorothy asked. 2 months, maybe less if things move quickly." Brennan paused. "I know that seems like a long time, but it's necessary." Dorothy nodded, then looked at Garrett. "Will you visit while I'm in protective custody?" "Every week," Garrett promised. "I'll bring Iris and Luther. You won't be alone." 3 months later, Garrett sat on the porch of his new house, watching the sunset over the Nevada desert. It was a small place, nothing fancy, but it was his. Not the clubhouse, not Iris's couch, his. A place where Caleb and Abigail could visit, where Iris could bring Nora for Sunday dinners, where Dorothy could sit on the porch and wine Harold's pocket watch, which had finally started working again 2 weeks after Vincent's arrest. The arrests had come fast, just like Brennan promised. 32 people in the first wave, including Vincent Crane and the CEO of Silver Point Development. Vincent was awaiting trial in federal custody, facing 40 years in prison. His bail had been denied after prosecutors argued he was a flight risk with the resources to disappear. Dorothy was living in Reno now in a small apartment the FBI had helped her secure after the protective custody period ended. She visited often, bringing cookies and stories about the trial preparations, about the victims of Silver Point's schemes who were finally getting their day in court. Iris and Garrett had been dating for 6 weeks. It was slow and careful and good. Nora had started calling him Uncle Garrett, and sometimes when he closed his eyes, he could almost imagine what it would have been like if he'd been there for Caleb, the way he was here for Nora now. Almost, but not quite. Some regrets never fully healed. They just became part of who you were. Caleb and Abigail visited every Sunday. Abigail's belly was growing rounder with each week, and Caleb had taken to reading parenting books and asking Garrett questions about raising children. Questions Garrett didn't always know how to answer because he'd failed so completely the first time. But Caleb would smile and say, "You're doing better now. That's what matters." And Garrett had left the Iron Reaper Motorcycle Club. Not in anger, not in shame, but because he'd found something he'd thought he lost forever, a reason to build instead of run, a reason to plant roots instead of chasing the horizon. Luther had understood, had clasped his hand at the clubhouse and said, "You'll always be a Reaper, Steel. The patch comes off, but the brotherhood doesn't." Garrett had opened a small motorcycle repair shop on the edge of town. The sign out front read, "Second Chance's Garage." Business was slow but steady. Mostly locals, some tourists, a few Iron Reaper members who made the drive out from Carson City because loyalty ran deeper than business. Luther still came by most mornings for coffee and bullshit sessions that lasted until mid-afternoon. The brotherhood didn't end just because the patch came off. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple, Garrett's phone buzzed. A text from Caleb. "Ultrasound today. It's a boy, Garrett Harold Briggs, named after two heroes. Coming over Sunday to tell you in person but couldn't wait. Love you, Dad." Garrett stared at the message until the words blurred. A grandson, named after him and Harold, two men who had made terrible mistakes and somehow found redemption anyway. He thought about that night in the Desert Star Diner, about 6 desperate words from a terrified old woman. "Please pretend you're my grandson, sir." He'd pretended then, but somehow in the weeks that followed, it had become real. Dorothy wasn't his grandmother by blood. Caleb wasn't Harold's grandson, but they were family in every way that mattered. And family, Garrett had learned, wasn't just about who you were born to. It was about who you chose to stand beside when the storm came. It was about who you fought for when the cost was everything. It was about who you became when someone believed you could be better than you were. The screen door opened. Iris stepped out carrying 2 glasses of iced tea, her hair loose around her shoulders, catching the last light of the day. "You okay?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Yeah," Garrett said, smiling. "Yeah, I really am." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the desert turn gold and orange and red as the sun sank below the mountains. Somewhere in Reno, Dorothy Whitmore was winding Harold's pocket watch, the hands finally moving again after 3 months of stillness, each tick a reminder that time moved forward even when you thought it had stopped. Somewhere in that same city, Caleb and Abigail were painting a nursery and dreaming about the future, about a little boy who would carry his grandfather's name and never know the broken man his grandfather used to be. And in a federal courthouse, prosecutors were building cases that would send corrupt men to prison for decades, all because an elderly woman refused to give up and a biker decided to help. The storm had passed. The road ahead stretched out bright and clear and full of promise. And for the first time in 12 years, Garrett Briggs was ready to ride toward it, not running from his past, but riding toward his future, with family beside him every mile of the way.